In a home where secrets linger beneath the surface, one moment changes everything. George steps closer, his voice trembling but firm. I can't deny it anymore. I have feelings for you I can't do without you. I'll love you in ways my father never could. Priscilla freezes, her voice breaking as she whispers, But George, I'm your stepmother. A forbidden confession, a relationship pushed to its limits, a family on the brink of collapse. Will boundaries be respected or will emotions destroy everything they've built? Before we dive into this story, please consider subscribing to my channel, turning on the notification button, and letting me know where you're watching from in the comment section below. Priscilla adjusted her pearl earrings and glanced out the car window as Raymond drove through the bustling streets of Lagos. The city was a whirlwind of energy. Cars honking, pedestrians weaving through traffic, and vendors calling out to sell their goods. She'd never seen anything like it. It was thrilling yet intimidating, much like her new life as Raymond's wife. When the gates to their home opened, Priscilla gasped. The mansion was a modern marvel, all glass and steel, with manicured gardens and a fountain that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Welcome home, Raymond said with a warm smile, squeezing her hand. His voice, steady and reassuring, calmed her nerves. As they stepped inside, the cool, expansive interior took her breath away. The marble floors reflected the crystal chandelier overhead, and the walls were adorned with tasteful artwork. Priscilla had imagined a comfortable home, but this was a palace. It felt like stepping into another world, a world where she wasn't sure she belonged. The sound of footsteps drew her attention. George, Raymond's son from his previous marriage, walked into the room. He was tall and lean, with neatly combed dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He extended a hand to her politely. Priscilla, welcome, he said in a tone that was formal, almost distant. Thank you, George, Priscilla replied, trying to sound confident. She searched his expression for warmth, but his face remained unreadable. The next few days were a whirlwind of adjustments. Raymond was ever the attentive husband, ensuring she was comfortable and showing her the ropes of running the household. But it was George's presence that unsettled her. He was polite to a fault, but his interactions with her were curt, and he avoided spending time in the same room as her for too long. Priscilla noticed little things. George would leave the dining table as soon as dinner was over, retreating to his room. His responses to her attempts at conversation were clipped, and when she asked about his work, he barely offered more than a sentence. Determined not to let the tension linger, Priscilla decided to try harder. She spent hours in the kitchen preparing George's favorite meals, jollof rice with grilled chicken, spicy pepper soup, and fluffy yam porridge. She even arranged the plates in an artistic way, hoping it would spark some form of connection. Thank you, George said one evening as he took his plate, his tone as neutral as ever. Do you like it? Priscilla asked hopefully. It's fine, he replied, then excused himself to eat in his room. Priscilla sighed, sinking into her seat. She couldn't understand what she was doing wrong. Was it her? Was he angry about her marrying his father? Or was this just his nature? Raymond, sensing her frustration, tried to reassure her. George is reserved. Give him time. He'll come around, he said, his tone kind but not entirely convincing. But time seemed to stretch endlessly as the days turned into weeks. George's aloofness became a weight on Priscilla's heart. She'd always dreamed of having a warm, close-knit family, but the icy wall between her and George felt unbreakable. One evening, as Priscilla stood on the balcony overlooking the garden, she whispered a silent prayer. She prayed for patience, for understanding, and for the strength to endure. Because deep down, she wasn't ready to give up, not on George, and not on the family she was determined to build. Unbeknownst to her, George stood in the shadows of the hallway watching her. His face was a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite place. For the first time, he found himself wondering who this woman truly was. Priscilla hummed softly as she prepared breakfast one morning, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling plantains filling the kitchen. She had spent countless days trying to connect with George, but her efforts had only been met with polite indifference. Yet, something within her refused to give up. She was so focused on plating the food that she didn't hear George enter. "Need any help?" Priscilla jumped slightly, turning to see him leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. It was the first time he had offered to help with anything. She smiled cautiously. "Sure. Can you slice those oranges?" George nodded and walked to the counter, picking up the knife. They worked in silence for a while, the sound of the blade meeting the cutting board filling the room. Priscilla stole a glance at him. He seemed different, less guarded, more at ease. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "For what?" George asked, his tone neutral. "For helping, and for giving me a chance." George paused, his hand hovering over an orange. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, his defenses seemed to lower. "You're trying really hard. I see that," he admitted quietly. Priscilla felt a spark of hope. "I just want us to be a family." George didn't respond, but he nodded slightly before returning to his task. Over the next few days, something shifted. George began spending more time in the kitchen while Priscilla cooked, asking questions about recipes and even offering to help. At first, his contributions were small, stirring a pot here, fetching ingredients there. But it was progress. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, George handed her a plate and smiled faintly. "You're good at this. Cooking, I mean." Priscilla laughed. "It's all about practice. Maybe I'll teach you some of my tricks." "Maybe," George said, his tone lighter than she'd ever heard it. They began to share small conversations. George told her about his work at an advertising agency and the challenges of landing big clients. Priscilla, in turn, spoke about her life before meeting Raymond, her love for teaching and her childhood in a small village. For the first time, Priscilla felt like they were making progress. The wall George had built around himself was starting to crack, and she couldn't have been happier. But then, subtle changes in George's behavior began to unnerve her. It started with compliments that felt slightly out of place. "You look nice today," he'd say, his gaze lingering a little too long. Or, "You're really amazing at what you do," his tone carrying a weight that made Priscilla uneasy. At first, she dismissed it as awkwardness. George wasn't used to opening up, and she figured he was just trying to be kind. But the looks grew more frequent, his stares more prolonged. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden discussing her plans to redecorate the guest room, George leaned closer than necessary. "You make this place feel alive," he said softly, his eyes locked on hers. Priscilla's smile faltered. She quickly stood, brushing off her dress. "I should check on dinner," she said, retreating into the house. Alone in the kitchen, she pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. She wanted to believe that she was imagining things, that George's intentions were innocent. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. That night, as Priscilla lay in bed beside Raymond, her mind raced. She thought about George's behavior, his words, and the way he looked at her. Was she overreacting, or was there something more to his actions? Unaware of the storm brewing within her, Raymond slept peacefully, his arm draped protectively over her. Priscilla closed her eyes, praying that this unease was nothing more than a passing phase. But in her heart, she knew it wasn't. The next few days were tense, as George's increasingly unsettling behavior continued to weigh on Priscilla. She found herself on edge, constantly second-guessing his intentions. She couldn't help but notice the way his gaze followed her across the room, how his compliments had turned from casual remarks to comments that felt too personal, too charged. One evening, while she was folding laundry in the living room, George entered, his footsteps soft but purposeful. The air between them had changed, thick with unspoken tension. "Priscilla," he began, his voice low as he sat beside her on the couch. She paused, the shirt in her hands momentarily forgotten. "Yes, George?" He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have said earlier." Priscilla's heart began to race. She had a sinking feeling that she wasn't going to like what came next. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. George shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering to the floor. "I've been fighting this, but I can't anymore. I have feelings for you. More than just the usual admiration. I've tried to push them away, but it's been hard. I'm sorry, but I needed you to know." Priscilla's breath caught in her throat, her body freezing as the words settled like a heavy weight in the pit of her stomach. She blinked, trying to process what she'd just heard. Her mind screamed at her to speak, to say something, anything. But all she could do was stare at George in stunned silence. He continued, his voice trembling. "I know it's wrong, and I don't want to hurt you or your relationship with Raymond, but I couldn't keep pretending I didn't feel this way. I thought if I kept it inside, it would go away. But it hasn't. I'm sorry." The room felt like it was closing in on her. She had never anticipated this. George, Desmond's closest friend, had just admitted to having feelings for her, feelings that went far beyond friendship. Priscilla's mind raced as she processed the revelation. She had trusted George, had believed his politeness and attempts to connect were genuine, but now she realized that trust had been a mask, hiding something darker. "George," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is wrong. You're my son-in-law. You're Raymond's son. This can't happen." George's face hardened, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. I know it's wrong, but I can't just ignore it anymore." Priscilla stood up, her hands shaking. She took a few steps back, her mind scrambling for the right words to say. "I don't know what to do. I need time to process this." She turned quickly, retreating to the safety of the bedroom, leaving George sitting there, his confession hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Inside the room, Priscilla sank onto the bed, her thoughts spinning in a whirlwind. She knew she had to tell Raymond, but how could she? How could she explain what had just happened without destroying everything? The fear of losing her marriage, the fear of destroying the fragile peace they had fought so hard to build, gripped her chest. What if telling Raymond pushed him away forever? What if it tore their family apart? But as the seconds ticked by, Priscilla knew there was no escaping the truth. She had to confront the situation head-on, and she had to decide whether or not she could trust George again. The days that followed George's confession were filled with an unsettling quiet. Priscilla couldn't shake the weight of his words, and they seemed to echo in her mind at all hours of the day. As much as she tried to focus on her life with Raymond, the anxiety lingered, gnawing at her. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself much longer. One evening, after dinner, when the house had quieted down and the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Priscilla found herself alone with Raymond. He sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, while Priscilla paced the room. Her heart beat in her chest, heavy and full of dread. "Raymond," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you." Raymond looked up from his phone, his expression softening as he noticed the seriousness in her tone. "What is it, love? You're scaring me." Priscilla walked over to him and sat down, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. She hadn't prepared herself for this moment, but she knew it had come. There was no turning back. "George, he told me something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Raymond's brows furrowed. "What did he say?" Priscilla closed her eyes, feeling the sting of George's words replay in her mind. He confessed that he has feelings for me, more than just friendship. He said he couldn't fight it anymore. The room seemed to freeze. The silence that followed was suffocating. Raymond's face paled, and his grip on his phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. "What?" he finally managed, his voice strained. How could he do that?" "I don't know, Raymond," Priscilla replied, tears threatening to spill. "I never wanted this. I never asked for it. I don't know what to do." Raymond stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "How could he? After everything I've done for him all these years?" His voice cracked with frustration and disbelief. Priscilla's heart broke at the sight of Raymond in pain, but she knew she had to be honest, no matter how much it hurt. "I tried to push it aside. I tried to avoid him, but I couldn't. He kept making things awkward, giving me compliments that didn't feel right, staring at me in a way that made me uncomfortable." Raymond stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes wide with a mixture of hurt and anger. "So what now? Do we just pretend this didn't happen? Do we let him keep his place in this family like nothing's wrong?" Priscilla stood up, wiping her eyes. "I don't know. I feel lost, Raymond. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't know what to do about George. He's your son, and this could ruin everything." Raymond looked at her with a pained expression, his voice filled with determination. "We're going to handle this together, Priscilla. I don't care how hard it is. We'll figure it out. But one thing is for sure. George needs to know that what he did was wrong, and he's going to have to make it right." Priscilla nodded, relief flooding through her as she realized that Raymond, despite his anger, was still willing to stand by her. They would face this challenge together, as they always had before. Raymond took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. "We'll get through this. I love you, and we'll rebuild whatever cracks George has created. But first, we need to talk to him, face to face." Priscilla's stomach turned at the thought, but she knew it was the only way. The truth had come out, and now they had to confront it head-on. As they sat down together, Priscilla couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. No matter how dark things seemed, she knew that with Raymond by her side, they could rebuild what had been shaken by George's betrayal. If you've been following this story and want to see what happens next in this drama-filled series, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the upcoming chapters. Don't forget to share this with your friends and comment below with your thoughts on what George should do next. Your support means the world, and we're so excited to have you on this journey with us. Stay tuned for more from the Paul series.